Well, good evening. Welcome to this live stream on the 25th of February 2025. It's Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Great to have you on tonight. And thank you very much for spending some of your Tuesday evening. And just to say that the conversation, of course, will be normally quite robust tonight, so be prepared for that, but it should be fun nevertheless. Just before I bring Robbie in, let me just remind you, we're not providing specific financial, legal, or anything else. This is general conversation. Please play nice in the chat, but feel free to throw your comments and questions in. If you use it Walk the World, that'll make sure I see your questions. It gets into my queue. I've enabled Super Chat, which means that you can get your question top of the list or indeed make a contribution to what we do around here. Greatly appreciated. As always, we don't do this for profit. We do this because there's an important conversation to be had. With that, Robbie, let me bring you straight in. Hi, Robbie. Good to see you once again. How are you doing?
Excellent, Martin. Very good. Waiting for an election. Can't pick the timing though.
No. My sense is probably later rather than earlier, given the fact that the RBA probably won't cut again and the polls don't look that positive, and we keep seeing these promises being hung out. If you re-elect me, I'll do X, Y, and Z, right?
Well, in case people don't know, I'm the Australian Citizens Party's Senate candidate for Victoria for this election. So even busier than usual. And I'm waiting to get into it. Anyway, we've pretty much started campaigning, and yeah, we're just waiting for the starter's gun for the official stuff. But it's go at the moment.
Yeah, it is busy, and there's a lot to be able to talk about. What I want to focus in tonight, Robbie, is this concept of the rules-based order, right? Now, I don't know whether you've heard Penny Wong recently, but she always used to say, Australia is the supporter of the rules-based order, right? And that now a lot of people are saying, oh, well, the rules-based order has been upended because of what Trump is doing, and it's no longer, relevant or appropriate. So I thought we should explore this. And what I want to do is to start broad and talk about, well, what was this rules-based order thing anyway? And, what was it really about, and who set the agenda and all those things? Then talk about where we currently are. And I want to try and get to the point of asking a really critical question, which is, how does the rules-based order or the upending of the rules-based order then impact Australia and the upcoming election and all of those things? Because I think, there are some interesting and quite important consequences, a lot of uncertainties as well. And of course, a lot of people are saying that the world is moving into a new world of, quote, uncertainty. But I'm not quite sure that's the full story. So let's start at the beginning. When I say rules-based order, what do you think about, and how did we get to this point?
Well, the first point to make about the rules-based order is it is not international law. And this is a very important point because some educationally challenged people assume it's one and the same thing. And it is absolutely and emphatically not. International law is clearly set down in the United Nations Charter, and it's based on a whole body of law going back to what's known as the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. And the foundation principle as expressed in that treaty and in the UN Charter is the principle is one of national sovereignty, right? Nation states are perfectly sovereign and their sovereignty must be respected. That's international law, and then there's human rights components, etc. The rules-based order is the misleading term applied to the US-led world order or the Anglo-American-led world order. And we often, in our organisation, we're often at pains to point out it is actually Anglo-American because it has become imperial in nature, and this is a way that the imperialists that still have too much power in the UK can maintain their imperial fantasies because they've got these. They do it through the trappings of international legality because they say, oh, these are the rules that everyone's supposed to follow. We call it our rules-based order. So America especially says to the world, these are our rules, you must abide by. And when countries are weak they never like it, but they tend to, well, there's not much they can do about it. And they grumble and groan, but they're trying to conform in certain ways. When countries are strong, though, and there's a handful of countries in the world that are pretty strong and have become stronger, they're the countries that say to the United States, not anymore, buddy. And then that's why we get all this discussion about the rules-based order, because then the Americans and the Brits and the Europeans flip out and say, oh, you're not following the rules. You are autocratic, you are authoritarian, you are this, you are that. We're all familiar with the language. And we assume that these countries are rogue nations that are in violation of international law. And in fact, the opposite is true. Most of the time, they're more concerned with upholding the UN Charter than the United States and its actual allies are. I got one example. There's quite a few examples, but just give you one example of how America applies the rules-based order as opposed to international law. When it comes to the sea, international law is defined by a thing called UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And this is a convention that was worked out, as with all international conventions and treaties, etc. They're very long, slow, painful processes to negotiate these things, but it's there. UNCLOS, United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. The United States sails flotillas, aircraft carrier groups through the South China Sea and even the Taiwan Strait between Taiwan, the province, the Chinese province, not nation, the Chinese province of Taiwan and mainland China, which is not international waters. It is Chinese domestic waters. So the US sails these carrier groups through that strait and other areas of the South China Sea, and they claim that these are freedom of navigation exercises enforcing UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. The only problem is China is a signatory to UNCLOS. America is not. America is not part of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. It has refused to ratify it. China has ratified it. The United States has not. But that is the laws of the sea that we're up there supposedly helping to enforce, and Australia too, in the South China Sea. And then, it bears mentioning at this point, breaking news. People might not have heard this yet, but there's 3 Chinese warships off the coast of Australia. Right now, they're off the east coast of Tasmania, actually. And the latest is those warships have been dropping these devices all along the coast of Australia, which are spying devices, which are finely tuned, calibrated things that can detect the differentiation of motion in the water from a long way away, so that they can tell the difference between a submarine, a warship, a commercial ship, a luxury yacht, etc. And these are spying devices that China's dropping along the coast of Australia, so we can spy on everything that we're doing off the coast of Australia. And that's why it's here. Oh, hang on. Sorry, I forgot that detail. No, that's what Australia's doing up in the South China Sea against China. That's what we are doing up in the South China Sea against China. We're up there. We're a permanent presence with the Americans, and we are doing that stuff all the time. We are permanently there in China's face doing this kind of thing. Clinton Fernandez, a very advanced, very prominent academic in Australia, has exposed this to the world. This is what we're doing. And once every 2 or 3 years, the Chinese come south and we literally shit ourselves. Every now and then, 1 in 100 times, but 100 times out of 100 times we're up there, 1 in 100 times they come down here to show us what it feels like, and we have a national meltdown like we're going through right now. Because the number one characteristic of the rules-based order, Martin, is sheer hypocrisy. It is utter garbage, and it's brought the world to absolute loggerheads. And unless we get out of this hypocrisy, grow up, we are going to be provoking things that may end up getting out of control. Anyway, that's the rules-based order. Well, that's what I think about when you ask a provocative question like, what's the rules-based
Well,
order?
I wanted to be provocative because I think it's really important, right? And so the point is there are the sort of implicit rules that the Western world have sort of come up with, right? Although actually the UN set of rules are not the same as the rules-based order, right? It's a really important point. What I would say, though, is that some of the other Western entities, the quasi-government organizations, tend to be more aligned with this rules-based order, right? So some of the stuff that some of those talk about are actually, they're actually obfuscating the difference between what the UN sort of framework is and what other people think is what's going on, right? So that there's actually complete confusion, firstly. Secondly, it's funny how the rules-based order seems to have been benefit a relatively small number of countries. And,
Yes.
you know, the net effect of this is that from an economic perspective and even from a political and social perspective, there are consequences that benefit a few nations relative to other nations as a result of this. And so there is not an innate connection between the rules-based order and fairness internationally. There's not a set of rules that everybody follows around the world because they are actually sort of UN directed. No. This is a completely different set of rules, right? A set of partisan rules and a set of rules that benefit a few rather than everybody else. And that's the point about this. So when everybody grizzles about the end of the rules-based order, what they're actually grizzling about is the end of a system that has evolved in a rather fluffy way, although quite an intentional way from as you say, the Anglo-US, stable, as it were. But the fact is that other people are now calling foul and saying, hang on a moment, this doesn't necessarily, one, equate to the UN story initially, and two, is not universally applicable. So that's why this is a really important conversation.
Well, I just want to clarify something about this UN question. Because when I say UN Charter and the UN, the essence of the UN is the Charter, the General Assembly, which is just a forum for all the nations of the world to talk to each other. And if we didn't have the UN, we'd still want to do something like that. The UN Security Council, which is quite dysfunctional nowadays, but it actually plays an important role. The biggest criticism you should probably have of it is its makeup is out of date. So it's ridiculous having Britain and France on the Security Council and not a country like India, right? Probably Brazil or whatever. Like these are big countries that don't get a look in. But the Security Council and of course it's got the non-permanent members as well. And so at least what the Security Council does is it defines an application of international law where you can tell if countries have gone outside of that, right? And so if they can't get approval for military action by the UN Security Council and they go ahead anyway, then it's clearly in breach of international law. So that's the Security Council. And then of course you have the Secretariat of the UN, which is the Secretary General, and that always has to be there to help administer the actual organization. However, and I think just that part of the UN is something, whatever we call it, you'd want to have it something like that anyway. It's been very important for the post-World War II world ever since we've had it. It helped for, even at the height of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, etc. And there was always discussion at the UN, and even it's much more dysfunctional in the last decade or so. But there are times when it plays an important role. There's a whole bunch of things associated with the UN though that I think do come more under this rules-based order idea, because it's they're formal organizations of the UN, but it's all this stuff that a lot of people might find themselves reacting to that get rammed into countries' agendas with the UN name attached to it, right? And there's stuff to do with social policy, there's stuff to do with human rights, because the word human rights is really nice, but there's a whole human rights agenda that just gets weaponized. And countries. Well, I can tell you now. This is actually a fact about how the UN operates. It is based headquartered in New York. Most people know. Ever since it started, its position in New York has allowed the United States and the CIA to run operations on the actual diplomats who have to work and attend there. You know, honeypot operations, etc., compromising operations, just to cheat in any way they can to get their way through the various UN forums. Now, they're not the only ones who do it. It's just they have a home ground advantage because they're in the United States, and that's where the UN is actually based. And so you can get things that come out of these UN forums and different international agencies that definitely have a bias and an agenda. Now, without going through all of them, the two that I think are worth mentioning are the ones that have had the biggest impact economically, which is the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Right, they're all sort of part of this whole body of international institutions, and they're the dominant ones when it comes to the economy. But for so long, they have been tools of Wall Street and London and the United States and the United Kingdom and Europe to enforce debt collection on nations, enforce neoliberal, and when nations fall into debt following IMF prescriptions, then in exchange for loans, the IMF forces these nations to swallow all these neoliberal reforms. And the essence of those neoliberal reforms is usually privatize everything to Western mining companies, Western banks, Western corporations. And so these countries end up getting picked apart, and they economically, and they stay eternally poor forever. And then we turn around and go, tut, 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 after 30 years of self-government in Africa, look, those black countries can't rule themselves. I mean, that becomes the narrative in the West, even though we set up the conditions for that to happen. And a lot of this stuff is UN adjacent as well, and sort of gets tied in with the UN, and it's not good. It's not the same as actual international law. These are things where different countries use their weight to get their own way. But it's all part of the it cuts both ways. And now there's a lot of screaming from the United States, because if you take a country like China, for instance, here's one very relevant fact about China. When Trump has threatened all these tariffs, now that Trump is back, if this was 15 years ago, those threats would have been devastating to China, because the US was almost its entire market. But now China exports more goods to the developing world than it does to the United States and Europe. And how is that possible? Because those are the same countries that over the years China has gone to and helped invest in infrastructure development in those countries, right? And so it has genuinely made friends, and those friendly countries are happy to support China in international forums and agencies. And this leaves the enforcers of the rules-based order increasingly isolated, because they've never offered a deal like that. They offer economic conquest or military invasion, right? And they've had a very different deal from China, and so that's been something where there's been a rebalancing of power in some of these international forums, and then that gets propagandized into the international forums don't work anymore because we countries who think we have the divine right to rule the world, we're not getting our own way.
Yeah, and just as you think about this rules-based order, I want to sort of segue this into the NATO extension, as it were, of the rules-based, because of course the philosophical basis of this Anglophile view was neoliberalism, as you've said, and that's something which really, frankly, around the world has failed to make a lot of people's lives better over time. But the other is the defense structure, and of course NATO. And the concept here was that the US would be the world policeman, that through NATO, Europe will be protected. And so if you look at Germany, for example, it's got very little in the way of its own forces. They've got, 35,000 US people in Germany at the moment, whereas the UK and France has nuclear, Germany doesn't. So the rules-based order morphed into a defense posture as well, which made the West effectively dependent on the US. And this dependency is really important to understand because, of course, what we're now seeing in Australia is the US and Australia ponying up and making big defense investments and, nuclear subs in 40 years' time and what have you, and, defense posturing, etc. So we're seeing the same old card playing out again, I think. But now with Trump coming in and saying, no, I'm going to put the US first, put America first, right? That means that Europe now can't necessarily bank on this NATO support umbrella being there into the future. And that's creating a huge amount of contention in Europe. And what we're now seeing, interestingly, is Europe coalescing more around what they're going to do over and against what the US is doing, right? And Trump opening dialogue with Russia and Putin, looking for trade opportunities between the US and Russia. And so some of these universal assumptions, or should we say Western assumptions, are now being very much laid bare. And a lot of people are feeling quite uncomfortable because of it.
Well, because our illusions have suddenly been popped. I mean, we have gone, those of us who, if you just take the Ukraine war as the example, those countries that just bought all the one-sided propaganda and went way out on a limb, and Anthony Albanese repeated it today. He talked about the illegal, immoral. The only thing he didn't say was unprovoked. That was the mantra for 3 years ago, though, because it's the anniversary. Oh, actually, Martin, it's the anniversary of you and I having a what must have been last week, was it? 3 years ago, we you said let's get on and talk this. We had a show about whether Trump would invade. I think Cookie Boy asked for it. We had a show about whether Trump would invade Ukraine, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. But anyway,
Putin in Ukraine, not Trump in Ukraine.
Sorry,
right?
Putin, Putin, not Trump. The moralizing is what I've been objecting to most for the last 3 years, and because the reason I've been objecting to the moralizing, where Putin is Hitler. This is the most evil thing since World War II that he's done, by the same people who were in Parliament in Australia, in Canada, in the United States Congress, in the British Parliament, when our countries invaded Iraq and killed 1 million people. And that wasn't evil. That wasn't immoral. That was, however, we chose to spin it ourselves. But we were just so sanctimonious in this moralizing. We've gone, and the assumption was, of course, that we had to do this because Uncle Sam wanted us to. We're all marching in lockstep with the United States. But the inherent contradictions of this policy was so great, they contributed to this tectonic political earthquake called the Trump re-election. And now that he's re-elected with 4 more years and no need to get elected after 4 years, so he doesn't even have to temper himself on that, and he got re-elected with a much greater majority than the first time, so he has a genuine mandate that even his opponents have had to, suck it up, right, and not doubt that he's got a mandate. They're making all the same accusations about him being a Russian agent and whatever, but no one's listening. No one cares. It worked 8 years ago. It's not working now. And he's just taken that rug and pulled it right out from under him. Well, that's one metaphor. The other metaphor is we're all out on a limb. All our countries are out on a limb, and he's gone there and he's just cut the limb off. And there's all this screaming going on. I think it's worth capping the just recapping the history really quickly about how we got to here. There was a crucial exchange at the end of World War II. And if you don't know history, or if you do know history, you'll know that the country that defeated Hitler was not England, good old England. My uncles fought in that war. was not the United States, though they played an important role. The country that broke the back of the Nazi war machine, and it was an awesome war machine, was the Soviet Union, and they lost 27 million people doing it. And they liberated Auschwitz, and they no longer get invited to the commemorations of the end of World War II and the liberation of Auschwitz. That's how effing sanctimonious we are. But anyway, at the end of that war, Molotov, I think he was, or Marshall, having a mental block. Anyway, the top Russian commander said to, I think, the US Secretary of State Stimson or someone like that, he said, if your country and our country forbade war, forbade any countries from going to war, no country would be game to do it. I mean, that was the kind of thinking after 70 million deaths in that war, right? The worst war in history. That was the sort of thinking. That was the offer Russia made to the Americans. Let us combine and let's just outlaw this thing called war. We've defeated this Nazi menace. Zhukov, thanks, Otto. Marshal Zhukov. We defeated this Nazi menace. Let's create the preconditions for peace. However, Franklin Roosevelt might have greeted that in a certain way, but he wasn't alive anymore, and he was replaced by a very small-minded individual named Harry S. Truman, and easily manipulated. And Winston Churchill got in Harry S. Truman's ear and said, okay, now we've beat the Nazis, let's straight away declare war on the Soviets and wipe them out too. Use the bomb if necessary. And that set up the Cold War, and it defined history until 1990. And, a month before he died, a month before he was assassinated, JFK gave a speech because he was desperate to stop the arms race getting out of control. And he wanted a nuclear arms testing limitation treaty with the Soviets. And he gave a speech to the Americans. And Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's now in Trump's cabinet, when he announced he was running for president, he quoted this speech at length because he actually made it more a foreign policy announcement when he made that announcement. And the speech is quite profound because JFK said to his fellow Americans, look, the Soviets are our adversaries. We don't have to agree with them, but we need to be able to look at the world through our adversaries' eyes and understand this. They won the war. They sacrificed the most people. They deserve our respect as a country, whether we agree with them or not. That's just the reality. And that's the olive leaf that he held out to get this treaty, because he was so concerned with stopping the Cold War turning into a runaway nuclear war, right? A month later, he was dead. Now, we don't have time to go into that, but I think the two things were related. And you need, if you ever want a little hint about why, there's an old 60s movie with starring Burt Lancaster called 7 Days in May. And the filmmaker was a friend of JFK's, and JFK asked him to make the film because JFK was at such loggerheads with his own Joint Chiefs of Staff who wanted nothing more than to blow the world up. They were itching to use these weapons, and it was only JFK that was stopping them. But anyway, that was the Cold War. That ended in 1990, but just coinciding with the ending, this is the funny bit, just as it's coming to an end in 1990, of course, we'd had the decade of the 80s where all the Western countries, in the name of extreme anti-communism somewhat, using the propaganda of anti-communism, embraced the thing that they held up to be the most anti-communist economic policies, because anything less than neoliberalism was called socialism, and you couldn't have that, right? And what they were actually doing was sowing the seed of their own destruction. I mean, US manufacturing peaked in 1979. By 1990, the American economy was already riddled with financial speculation. You had the 87 stock market crash, etc. It had well and truly started here. It swept the whole world. Margaret Thatcher was elected in 1979. Reagan elected in 1980. Hawke and Keating came in 83. Roger Douglas and David Long in New Zealand in this thing swept the whole world in the 80s, and they started outsourcing, downsizing, deregulating, privatizing, etc. And this happened everywhere. And of course, what they were doing was allowing financial parasites in Wall Street and London and the Sydney banks and Melbourne banks, etc., to just feed off the productive economy. But it didn't really. The consequences, were slow to catch on in a sense, because the adversary was weakening, and that was the Soviets. They were weakening, and of course the whole thing came to an end in 1989. The wall came down in 1990, and so what America did in its sheer arrogance, with the Brits in their ear, America, instead of looking at this post Cold War world and say, oh, here is an opportunity for embracing economic development for the whole world. I mean, our party, the Citizens Party, was in close collaboration with organizations like the Schiller Institute and the American economist Lyndon LaRouche, who actually put forward proposals for things like a Eurasian land bridge, and he had an idea for a European productive triangle where the developed Western countries of Europe would build infrastructure in the East, the poorer Eastern countries that had been under communism, and uplift them and all that kind of thing, get the economies moving. But see, none of that happened because ideologically, the Western governments were completely opposed to it. So instead of reaching out and saying, how do we make the world uplift the whole world, it's like, how do we loot the world? They went into Russia and looted it to death. The Chinese were much smarter than that, though. They weren't as weak as Russia, and they were the source, the destination for all the outsourcing, because of the Chinese labor was so cheap. However, China was very smart and said, yeah, you can come and set up your factories here, but it's 50% local ownership. And all these Western countries couldn't agree fast enough. 30 years later, they're screaming, you stole it. You stole our technology. No, you agreed to the terms when you set up. You wanted the cheap labor, but China put conditions on it. They're not some weak little country that can't stand up to you. They put conditions on it. They made sure it benefited them. You're trying to rewrite history with this technology theft garbage. But my point, the reason I'm going through that is because they wanted to dominate the world. America said in 1992. They pronounced the Wolfowitz Doctrine that said our foreign policy will be geared to ensure that we will never have a rival military or economic power. So they didn't want a world in which all the countries agreed to cooperate. They wanted a world where that was the real beginning of what we are now hearing, this mantra of the rules-based order. They said, we are the dominant country and we will always be the sole superpower, and that's it. You follow our rules. But economically, they were getting increasingly incapable of backing that up. Militarily, that's all they had. They threw so much money into the military, the expansion of NATO, all this kind of stuff, that it left them in a very unbalanced situation. The expansion of NATO, I mean, I got to know Malcolm Fraser quite well before he died. He was one of many senior statesmen around the world who said as soon as the Cold War was over, NATO should have been disbanded. NATO was there to guard Europe against Soviet expansion. The Soviets didn't exist anymore. There was nothing to guard against. It should have been disbanded. But the British original idea for NATO was always what was the operating factor to this day. And the first Secretary General of NATO was a British general. Can't remember his name offhand, but he said, the purpose of NATO is to keep the Americans in, the Germans down, and the Russians out. Or the Soviets out, is the way he said it. That was the purpose of NATO, keep the Americans in, the Germans down, and the Soviets out. Now, think about what you just said a second ago. Donald Trump's come along, and now the equation looks like, hang on, the Americans may not be in, the Russians are having direct talks with the Americans again, and there's the Europeans that are out. They weren't invited to these talks, and they've all whined about it. And Trump said, well, you had 3 years to fix this problem. Why should you be at the table? Right? Because the same countries, of course, were ridiculing him all that time. And Donald Trump represents an American who became sick of paying the bill for this unbalanced economy that has no manufacturing, because he wasn't part of the plot to get rid of American manufacturing. He was just one of these people that wised up one day and said, where all is this gone? It's got no manufacturing to speak of compared to what it used to have, and it's got this massive military that when you invest so much in the military, you're going to be tempted to use it. And out of interest, here's a little historical fact in case, because Donald Trump is a bit of a bloviating individual. You don't know what to take seriously from him or not. His uncle's name is John Trump. John Trump was part of the Manhattan Project. He was a scientist in the Manhattan Project. And you can hear Donald Trump talk about this. Uncle John seared onto Donald's brain from a young age that the worst thing possible is nuclear war. Trump talks about that. He got that from his uncle, who worked on the Manhattan Project with Oppenheimer to help build the bomb. So he has some very strong views on it. He doesn't like paying the bill. He doesn't like nuclear war. He prefers business over war. And he doesn't want to be the schmuck who the Europeans exploit anymore, the way he sees it, to maintain this thing called NATO. And now the thing that they've worked so hard to manipulate and keep in place for 70 years, 80 years, could be about to all start crumbling down.
Yeah, and one of the interesting observations there was this so-called peace dividend, which came post particularly the 90s, right? So if you look at the average defense spending on a GDP basis, it dropped and dropped and dropped and dropped and dropped. Now, of course, everyone's now saying, oh, we've got this uncertain world, and now we need to actually accelerate defense spending. There's an impending war coming. There's, we don't have enough troops. We don't have the right kit. So everyone is now calling for a significant rise in defense budgets around the world. And we're seeing that in the UK. We're seeing it across Europe. And I sort of question again, well, who's driving that? Because, of course, the defense industries boom, and those manufacturing industries that support the defense industries boom. But really, is this a sensible strategy given where we are and what we're trying to do? Because it seems to me that, we can increase defense spending, but surely this is not actually a path to success into the future.
Look, the term military-industrial complex has become like a street slogan. People don't take it that seriously anymore. Hippies have been saying it since the 60s. But it is worth remembering that phrase was coined by an American president warning against it. And he wasn't just any schmuck. He wasn't a Donald Trump. He was America's top commander of World War II in his day, right? Highly respected. And he said, look, we've never had standing armies before. We never had a standing arms industry. Now that's what we've got. He's saying this in 1960. We have to guard against this. And what the size of it in 1960 was tiny compared to what it is now. And this has been a motivator so much. In fact, when we spoke in that show we did 3 years ago, Martin, where we were tossing up, would Putin invade Ukraine or not? And the main point I remember making that show was that the Russians had given this document to the Americans and said, look, this is what we want to negotiate. And I said on that show, you will know if there's going to be a war based on how the Americans respond to that document. And they didn't even look at it. They said, we're not going to talk about anything. And now I'm no expert, but I was strong enough on that point. That's why I was right. That's why Putin went into Ukraine, because they wouldn't even talk. Now they're actually talking. But one of the factors on the American side is Biden had got elected or inaugurated in January 2021. Middle of the year, he pulled out of Afghanistan in a very, very messy way. Remember, bodies falling off the plane, etc. Leaving a whole heap of junk there. When I say junk, US military hardware and the whole scandal. But that Afghanistan war, McM has said war is a racket. That's what General Smedley Butler said, yes. And that Afghanistan war was an example of it, right? 20 years and $10 trillion to replace the Taliban with the Taliban. But it was a feeding trough for the weapons companies. They made squillions out of it. when Biden ended the war, those weapons companies, Lockheed Martin and all the rest of it, redoubled their lobbying efforts in Washington, in Congress, to push for an escalation against Russia over Ukraine. They were lobbying for it, right? You can actually, this is documented how much they lobbied to make sure that war happened. The idea that it's one-sided was absolutely ridiculous, and they've been making so much. Now, it's one thing I didn't like. It's one thing I found very contradictory about Trump the first time around. Trump said he was against war, but he kept demanding all these countries increase their defense spending. Now, the equation was so America didn't have to spend so much, but nevertheless, it meant all this extra money for the military-industrial complex. If they've all got to be up to 3% or 5% or whatever he was demanding, it's just all extra money for the military-industrial complex. Well, he still says that a little bit, but it's actually he's changed his tune somewhat. And I'm not, it's all talk, so I don't know. We have to see how it plays out. But I nearly fell off my chair 2 weeks ago when, just off the cuff, he said he wants to get together with Putin and Xi and say, let's all agree to cut our military spending in half. Right? Now, if that actually happened, I mean, what does that do for Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman and Thales and all the rest of them? Right? They will be beside themselves in rage. Actually, just a quick aside, what's his name? The filmmaker Michael Moore, in his movie about the Iraq War, Fahrenheit 9/11, he shows a scene there from a cocktail party in America when the Iraq War started, where all these business guys are cheering the war, not out of patriotism, but for all the money they're going to make, right? And they're just openly cheering it. I mean, this is a real thing. So here's Trump suddenly a couple of weeks ago saying, "Well, let's halve our military spending." Anyway, the funniest thing about all this is Keir Starmer, your prime minister over there in the UK. He is so desperate to somehow try and buy Trump off his current direction and keep the Ukraine war going. He's going to scurry over to Washington, probably get the same treatment Macron is just get, because Trump doesn't care if he contradicts these people in front of them. But Keir Starmer is going to scurry over there to Washington, and one of the things he's offering is he's desperate to increase. He says the UK is going to increase its defense spending to 5% of GDP. You couldn't afford 2.5% of GDP, for crying out loud. What an utter joke. I listened to Alistair Crook, this former MI6 officer, diplomat, and Arabist, really smart British guy. You can watch him on shows like Judge Napolitano. He has a really keen sense of these international dynamics with geopolitics at the moment. And he just pointed, it's such an utter joke that the UK could afford half of this. I mean, Rolls-Royce is supposed to be building the nuclear reactor that's going to be in the AUKUS submarine in 40 years' time. It's just been ruled out now that they're even capable of doing it. And this is Rolls-Royce, right? Is there a more advanced industrial company in the UK than Rolls-Royce? There's a decline going on here. And they're just not up to it economically to do anything like this. Yet they're trying to relive past glories or something. And they're so desperate, though, to keep that money flowing in that direction. And it's been one of the biggest scams of all time. So if that's a product of, if that's a side effect of Donald Trump's chaos at the moment, and it results in less money for these weapons makers, bloody good.
And just on that, as Hex Amigo pointed out, didn't Australia just buy some submarines? Well, there is this, I think last time the PM went over to the US, he took a check with him, right, to show Trump that he was actually serious about investing in US defense systems and what have you. 40 years or so down the track, we're going to get some nuclear subs, maybe or maybe not. This is a classic case of being sucked into and then posturing to a set of objectives that really don't make a lot of sense.
Well, we're actually lunatics. Paul Keating pointed out that when Albanese, who, remember, Albanese was called up by Scott Morrison one day in late 2021, by which time Albanese knew that he was favourite to win the election when it happened. He gets called up, and Morrison says, I've just worked out this deal with Boris Johnson and Biden to buy these AUKUS submarines and create this compact called AUKUS. But Biden says that he's not going to commit unless you, the opposition leader, also agree. You got 24 hours to say whether you agree or not. And it was it actually, what happened next was a foretaste of what has happened ever since with Albanese. Because instead of showing some spine and saying, get the hell out of my face, you worst prime minister in history, you most hated and reviled person, I will get only popular by publicly dressing you down over this. You don't give me an ultimatum like that. Instead of saying that, he put his tail between his legs and bleated out, yes, we'll do it. And so when he had to follow through on that and went to San Diego, and there's him and Biden and Rishi Sunak back then, and Paul Keating was at the press club and pointed out, they're all playing, Hail to the Chief or whatever, celebrating $368 billion deal with Australia. And he said there was one payer, and that's the Australian Prime Minister, one payer. And we're not even close to, we're not buying submarines yet. We're putting down payments for the industrial capacity of America that we're investing in, and the industrial capacity of the European, of the British shipbuilding enterprises that we're investing in. We haven't even bought anything yet. And we've signed a deal where at any time we pay and pay and pay, and at any time both those countries can say, oh, sorry, we can't deliver. I mean, it is an utter joke. And what it's evolving into is nothing's going to happen. The actual AUKUS submarines that are supposed to be made in the UK, that's never going to happen. They can't even get Rolls-Royce's act together. And so the interim measure of us buying these Virginia-class nuclear submarines from the United States, the US Congress has said, well, we can't afford to let them go. We don't have enough ourselves. And so the compromise they've come up with, and the whole thing's probably a charade, and this was planned from the beginning, the compromise is, oh, well, no problem. These are for use against China anyway. We'll just take them down to Australia, American manned, American commanded, and America will just protect Australia, and problem solved. And so that means our sovereignty as a country is severely curtailed by agreeing to this deal. And they're not going to be used to protect Australia. They're going to be used up in the South China Sea to contain China, not to protect Australia. My little rant at the start of the show about these devices that Australia's Navy and Air Force are involved in deploying in the ocean as spying devices on China. The whole purpose of those devices is to be able to detect the difference between Chinese fishing boats, Chinese commercial ships, Chinese military ships, and Chinese submarines, so that when Chinese nuclear-armed submarines sneak out of China's shallow waters to go into deep water and go down really deep and just sit there for ages as a nuclear deterrent, so that they're supposed to be hidden and not detectable, so that if they're notified there's some kind of nuclear standoff, it's not just the Soviets, the Russians that America has to worry about, it's the Chinese ones as well. And so the whole point of a nuclear deterrent is the Americans know, well, if we ever use nuclear weapons on China, they're going to use them back on us. But what America's trying to do is make sure it can detect these submarines leaving, and we're helping do that, so it can silently follow them with their submarines, park behind them, and in the event of some kind of standoff, kill them first and knock out China's deterrents. So then America is free to drop nuclear bombs on China. That's the game. It makes the world a very dangerous place. That's the game we're assisting in. That's what the submarines are for. They are not for defending Australia from an invasion. And if you think that's a good idea, go vote for Peter Dutton. And I will pray for your kids if we ever have a bloody war and the missiles start raining down on us. It is insanity. There's no need for this. We are the ones in their face, in China's face, provoking this because we have accepted the legitimacy of America's rules-based order doctrine that says it will not tolerate the rise of a rival power. And sorry, China is a rival power, and they're flipping out about how to handle it. And maybe the only, that's the unknown part of the Trump deal. He's doing these things with Russia. What does it mean vis-a-vis China? Because there's people in Trump's ear saying, make friends with China, make friends with Russia so that we can all join forces together and destroy China. And if he listens to that, it'll be madness.
Yeah. And it is ironic, isn't it, that at a time when the holes in the NATO model, US supporting Europe, is showing now, in the Asian region, Australia is cuddling up and poodling along, but not for the defense of Australia. That's the key point, right? That's what four submarines are not going to protect the shoreline of Australia. Yeah,
it's a joke. There's actually, there's right now, we got a briefing this morning from Richard in their office. Right now, there's 25 operational ships in the whole Australian Navy to guard a coastline of, some smart person might put how long the Australian coastline is in the chats, but what is it, 10,000 kilometres, 12,000 kilometres, the coastline? It's very, very big. 25 ships in total is what we have left operationally in the Royal Australian Navy. 4 submarines. And that's why you got to call out the BS. It's actually not what it's for, right? It's for us. We've handed ourselves over to an agenda to confront China. And I did an interview with a former ambassador, John Lander, about this. And when the Ukraine war started, he pointed out very succinctly, the problem is Australia is being set up to be the same thing. So just a quick, actually 7:30 report last night interviewed a Ukrainian. Sarah Ferguson interviewed the Ukrainian. This Ukrainian said something that I was saying for 3 years, but he said it emphatically because he was trying to make a different point. But he said the war didn't start in 2022. It started in 2014. And that was the truth of the whole thing. What started in 2014 was the United States ran a coup inside Ukraine to topple a democratically elected government and replace it with a government that they could control. And part of Ukraine was Crimea, which, quick history lesson, Crimea was always part of Russia, but Nikita Khrushchev, who was Ukrainian when he was the Soviet Union General Secretary, he gave Crimea to Ukraine as a gift. And so from the time of Khrushchev, Crimea was part of Ukraine. The vast majority of people in Crimea were Russian-speaking, though. When the wall came down and all these countries became independent, the Russians had to do a deal with Ukraine because Crimea hosts its only warm water port in Sevastopol. And without that port, the Russian Navy cannot deploy in winter because they get frozen in the northern ports in winter. They need that port. That is crucial to their strategic defense, that port. And suddenly, the country they lease it, because they did a deal with Ukraine to lease it, suddenly the friendly neighbouring country, the New Zealand to their Australia, that they were leasing that port from, was under the control of the country that wants to destroy them. Zbigniew Brzezinski in 1997 wrote a whole plan about how they're going to destroy Russia and split it up into at least 7 pieces. And so the Russians were not under any illusion about what the Americans were doing, messing around in Ukraine and toppling this government to be right up in their face. They'd been protesting the whole expansion of NATO since the mid-90s. They'd been protesting it. Top Americans were protesting it, saying, look, American Russia experts were saying to their own government, don't do this. This is crazy. For 30 years, the experts warned if we keep moving closer to Russia, Russia will go to war. That was the warning. And so when the warning finally comes true, only a moron would turn around and blame the country that goes to war. I mean, it's not a nice thing, but there's no tiddlywinks here. This is not, picking daisies, Sunday school picnic stuff, right? The top experts in the world, in the United States, had warned this. The top people like George Kennan, the last American ambassador to Russia, they all said it. Paul Keating said it in 1997. Malcolm Fraser was saying it. If you keep doing this, it'll end up in a war. That's the war that ended up. But America triggered it the most in 2014 when it ran this coup. And that's why Russia moved into Crimea, to make sure it secured its port against this American-controlled government that had just been taken over its neighboring country in a coup. That's what started it. And so this idiot on 7:30 last night was saying that's when Russia invaded Ukraine. Yeah, because you sided with a foreign government to run a coup in your country against a democratically elected government, and you think you're messing with, you think America can say, hang on, we make the rules in our favor and no other country's going to do it. Well, the Russians made it really clear that they want a sphere of influence too, and the Chinese are saying the same thing. And if America can have that right, we can't say to America, well, we have that right too. America will just laugh at us, but we're not China and we're not Russia. And if America insists on those kind of rights for itself, there are now countries in the world that can say to America, hey, buddy, we get that right too. And guess what, buddy? We're not over in your country. We're not over in the Western Hemisphere messing around in your inside, up in your face, in your grill, like you are with us. So, yeah, we're going to define the sphere of influence. We, China, are going to say, we don't want you in the South China Sea. Get the hell out of here, and we're going to regard it as hostile. And if your little poodle Australia is going to do that as well, every now and then we're going to go down to the Southern Hemisphere, and we're going to remind them what they're messing with. And Russia's now doing the same thing. And that's where this whole Ukraine conflict started. And now, what is it? Hundreds of thousands of dead men later, it looks like Zelensky, the ultimate little poodle, will be forced to accept a deal. And what Australia is doing, by not just with the submarines, but we've got Marines based in Darwin, B-52s based in Darwin, US B-52s, that are nuclear capable, we're told, but we don't ask if they've got nuclear weapons. We have a don't ask, don't tell policy. Penny Wong was stripped apart by David Shoebridge on this in Senate estimates last year or the year before, and she looked severely embarrassed. But if there's nuclear weapons on those B-52s up in Darwin, we are in breach of our treaty that we're party to with the whole South Pacific, that we've been party to since the 80s, of having no nuclear weapons in the South Pacific. And the only reason we're not in breach of it's like Schrodinger's bloody cat. Our policy is we're not going to ask the Americans if there's nuclear bombs on them. But answer me this, Martin. Why would America station these B-52 bombers in Darwin that are there for a nuclear war if they're not going to have nuclear weapons on them? Now, there's B-2 bombers, stealth bombers in Brisbane that are also nuclear capable. They've also probably got nuclear weapons on them. And we're hosting US nuclear submarines in Perth. And we have been hosting this massive US military buildup that at the height of the Cold War, sovereignly minded Australian governments would never have considered. We had the Americans here in World War II because we were in a war. But we're not in a war. We didn't get into a war in the Cold War, and they would never have considered having this American military presence in Australia. But this current generation of politicians are so weak and cowardly and sycophantic, they have turned us into Ukraine. And if there's a war, if it gets out of control, the Chinese and the Americans will be at pains not to fight directly with each other, because that risks an escalation into a nuclear conflict, just as the Americans and the Russians have not fought directly. Ukraine has been the proxy for America's war. And the proof of that was Zelensky agreed to a deal in April 2022, a month after the war started. He agreed to terms to end the war, to declare neutrality. They would not join NATO, all that sort of stuff. And the Americans sent in Boris Johnson, the British Prime Minister, to stop him. So they could keep him, and the defense secretary, what's his name? Biden's defense secretary, and people like him bragged about this is the best war they've ever been part of, because America's weakening Russia, but no American soldiers dying. It's all Ukrainian soldiers dying. And that's how they will treat Australia. And then when they're sick of that game, America will do to us exactly what America is now doing to Ukraine. Even though, it's a different president, etc., that is what America does. It'll just pull the rug out from under it and go, oh, well, tough, sorry, too bad about all the dead bodies. Meanwhile, John Mearsheimer predicted this back in 2016. He said America is leading Ukraine down the primrose path, and Ukraine will get wrecked. That was his warning, and that warning applies to Australia with the direction we're going by now in this military build-up here, unless Trump's better instincts prevail and he also makes sure that we don't escalate into a war with China.
Yeah, and it's serious and consequential. The point is that the politicians on both sides here in Australia have basically sold ordinary Australians down the river on this, I think, as so many other things. And they are struggling to come to the understanding that we now live in what we might call a multipolar world, right? So it isn't just the US, right? There are two factors now to think about. Firstly, there are more transactional and you could say mercurial people sitting in various countries around the world. And that includes Trump, and you can talk about Russia, and you can talk about China, and So that's the first point. The second point is, and remember I showed you on our last show, the map of the world, right? The map of the world that only included North America and a bit of Europe, right? And maybe Australia, right? There is a whole world out there. And it's just reflecting, of course, that the greater proportion of economic activity is actually outside of the Western US, Australia, New Zealand centre of gravity. And those are factors that people need to take into account here. We are now living in a very different world, and a lot of people in positions of power in other countries are not prepared to play the old game.
No, it's the balance of power has well and truly shifted. This is the most dangerous thing about the Americans in particular, and it's bizarro world, or it's upside down world, where the media still try to present Trump as the crazy one. Now, the crazy ones are the Americans who want to play this game of acting like they are the America of the 60s, all conquering, the most powerful country in the world, but they can't back it up. They don't have that strength. The only thing they've got is their military, and that's it. But a military is not enough. You need to have an actual economy, and their economy is shot. And so it has not been. No one has. The thinking countries of the world have not aspired to be like America for years. What they've been looking at is the economic miracle in China. And China has been so spectacular. China has become the center of gravity of the global economy, and they all want to do business with it. And China has gone, and not entirely altruistically, but this, like the China bashers just tried to present China's economic outreach to the world in the same as if China was a 19th century European power playing this game, just practicing colonialism. No, they got it all wrong. China knows the importance of markets for its manufacturers. It looked at how it achieved economic growth and said, well, we can help other countries do that. And the more they develop and grow, the better a market they'll be for us. And they've proven it. And that's what Belt and Road is. These kind of projects, and they've gone and invested in that. It's not so. China's one, and of course, uh, the BRICS is this larger gathering that China is still the center of. Actually, I don't know if this is true or not. I mean, Trump might just be a joker, but Trump has said some silly things. Of course, I've said some nice things about him tonight, but he said some silly things lately as well, including about the BRICS. And he claimed that he didn't know if China was a member of the BRICS. Of course, the C in BRICS is China. So you think, oh, surely he can't be that ignorant. But nevertheless, that's what he said. Um, so you got the BRICS, and that's a very big trade and growing trade arrangement, right? And it's strategic insofar as it's pursuing trade to benefit countries, but it's not actually strategic; it's economic. They don't have a militaristic agenda, but by consolidating economic relationships in this forum called the BRICS, it has a strategic impact because those countries are going to want peaceful relations with each other, right? Because the economic benefits are so great. And then you have the area of the world that was always the target of what they called the Great Game between the British Empire and the Russians, which is Eurasia. And you've got these other arrangements that Russia is part of, called the Eurasian Economic Forum, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is a security oriented defensive security oriented organization. But these are strong relationships that pretty much cover the whole of the Eurasian landmass, big chunks of the Middle East. And then, of course, you've got China's impressive economic relationships with African countries and with South American countries. In fact, I think, no EU nation is in BRICS. Otto's right. And I think, China has deals with 50. I think if there's 51 African countries, China has deals with 50 out of 51 of those African countries. And then you have these other knock-on effects, Martin, because of a general weakening of the old rules-based order, the US West European dominance, and you see that in places like North Africa with all these Francophone countries, West Africa, all these Francophone countries that have thrown off the shackles of French colonialism, the remnants of that, which is in the form of this this arrangement that you probably know better than me, where the French they use the French pound or a version of the French pound that the French printed for them, right? And the French were able to keep their claws in those countries that way. And there's been a series of changes of government, military coups, etc. One of the most interesting ones is what's happening in Sierra Leone. I think it's Sierra Leone, where there's this young military guy who's come to power there, and he's even doing things like they've stopped exporting gold. They've created a development bank. They've created a postal bank. That got our attention. They've created a postal bank in their country, right? To actually encourage the economic development of their own country, and they've been able to do that because they finally got the French colonials out of their face. And because these old colonial countries, old habits die hard. I mean, France still has an actual colony over here in the Pacific, for crying out loud, in New Caledonia, and there's a bit of unrest there at the moment. Sorry, the French franc. Sorry, there's a bit of unrest there at the moment, which France. Oh yeah, Burkina. This is good technology, Martin. Burkina Faso. Whoever said that, thank you very much. No, you're right. It's Burkina Faso. That's where John Sulman, Burkina Faso. That's where this young military commander has come to power and doing all these sweeping arrangements. The French, in New Caledonia, they're being quite oppressive in the way they're putting down this independence movement over there, and of course that's all good. Apparently, that's the New Caledonians don't have the right for self-determination, right? Because France wants to keep its an actual colony going. Anyway, in Africa, they don't have that power anymore, and there's some sweeping economic changes as a result of that. That is the world. And what we have done in our countries, it's this idea of being out in a limb again. We have woken up and found ourselves quite isolated. But although your audience here, Martin, I can tell from the comments is is thanks, Otto. Although your audience here is I can tell from the comments has a fair amount of literacy on these subjects, they would also know that this is not reflected in the mainstream understanding, political understanding in Australia. Not at all. Right? They still think that they still use expressions, just throwaway expressions like the US president is the leader of the free world. What the hell does that mean anymore? Right? He is the leader at the back of a straggling pack, I can tell you. Now he hopes to change that, but we are way behind in our understanding of these developments, and that's why it seems so confusing to the powers that be at the moment.
Yeah, and I just want to highlight a couple of things that you said there. This idea that the US is the policeman of the world, the leader of the free world, some dominant position that effectively everybody else has to look up to. That, of course, is still what some people within the US might like to believe. But the reality is that we are now in this multipolar world. There are many cross currents. There are many other players that actually have significant muscle and significant intent, although not necessarily wanting to play the same game as the US did play over the last 100 years. And I think that's really important. It's what I quite often see is that people within the US assume that China, for example, or other players are playing the same game that the US played. And I think that's probably the first really important. No, they're not playing the same game at all. They're playing a very different game, and it's important to understand that. The second is that given that we've got this significant shifting of powers in the multipolar world, the economic structures and social structures are likely to be quite different in the next 100 years or so than what we've had before. And so normality won't be restored. It's not like we can go back and click our fingers and go back 20, 30, 40, 50 years and there will be, this nirvana of peace and security. People talk about the World War II peace dividend and we never want to have another war, etc. Now, I don't want another war. War is an absolute, last resort, shouldn't be allowed to actually occur. Trouble is, you've got people that actually sometimes make bad decisions on the wrong reasons, economically driven or whatever. But the fact is, we're in this new environment. Now, in this new environment, Robbie, and as we're thinking now, came back to Australia, right? We've got the election coming up sometime between now and May. And I guess if I was sitting in Australia thinking about some of this stuff, thinking about, so what is the political story that we should be talking about in Australia? What are the key messages that we should be getting out there into the current debate and the political campaign processes ahead of the next election? Because it seems to me that, this is a really critical turning point potentially for Australia. And the decisions that we take, maybe in May, could well determine what happens economically, socially, and politically for quite a long period of time, given the fact that the major parties are both on the nose, given the fact that there are a lot of minor parties out there. So it seems to me we are at quite a critical turning point potentially.
Yeah, well, if we don't want to find ourselves, if we don't like being in this position where we're stuck out in a limb because we followed the previous direction of the US so faithfully, like their faithful hound, then that defines something that we should fight at the election over. And that's what our party is fighting. So we have two sort of headlines for our policy approach. One is economic sovereignty, and that means a bank owned by the people of Australia that can have the ultimate control over the financial system, etc. But one is actual national sovereignty. We have to assert ourselves to be a sovereign nation and no longer go along with these things that are not in our independent national interest. And the thing that we've been saying since 2019, 2020, in relation to the way Australia suddenly became hostile to China because we followed America down that path is hang on, this is our biggest and best trading partner. We make so much money out of this relationship with China that far more than any other country in the world, per capita, etc. It's quite extraordinary. That is our national interest to have that relationship. Yet, because of our foreign policy subservience to the United States, we're trashing it. Right? This does not make any sense. A sovereign country would not do this. And with these, so that's already brings into stark relief what we were doing and why we need economic sovereignty. And then with what you just described with these are rapid tectonic plate shifts geopolitically that are happening in the world. We have a multipolar world. We have the United States, we have China, we have Russia, we have India itself. And I'll tell you a little secret about India. India often appears to be very anti-China, and people often comment on that. It gets exploited. But the fact is, both India and China are partners in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, treaty partners. They're signatories to a treaty that's registered at the United Nations. They have treaty obligations to each other that is far stronger. Those obligations are far stronger through the Shanghai Organization than Australia's obligations through what's called the Quad to India, Japan, and the United States. And yet we've been we've been kidding ourselves that India is somehow our counterposition to China because we're part of the Quad and it's there. No, India is a country that has a clear sense of its own independent national interest, and it doesn't do these long-term deals with countries. It gets on very well with Russia. And it will make its own mind. Thank you very much. And so that's one of the big poles in the world because it's got the world's biggest population now. And where the West is just but ignorant, and they make the mistake with China, and they're going to make the mistake with India as well, is they like to project on these countries what they like to project, Martin, is they say those countries are going to are threatening to do are a threat to do what we would do if we were them, right? So if India and China were Western European countries with westernized systems, they would look to flex their muscles and conquer the world, but they're not. And these dumb European analysts just don't get the difference between their Western thinking and this Asian thinking, and it's more of a practical matter, not just because there's a genuine aversion to war. It's a practical matter. When you've got a population that big, you are flat out trying to make sure that you can manage that and take care of them and deliver economically for them. Now, China has done it spectacularly. India knows it's got to get its act together, and it's definitely committed to doing it. We don't know how successful it'll be, if it's going to have the same success rate as China yet. It's going to take a while, but it'll increasingly become a big factor. And these two countries are right to the north of us, or one side and the other. So an independent country would be saying, well, let's get on well with that country. Let's get on well with that country. Hell, we've got a very big country right above us called Indonesia. And Indonesia, I can tell you, I've been learning a lot about Indonesia lately. We had the Citizens Party's Senate candidate for Western Australia is someone who was born in Indonesia, Aisha Novakovic. She's a really smart lady over in Western Australia, and she's been telling me, Australia has a friendly relationship with Indonesia. People might remember when Albo got elected. I think it was his first trip was to go see Joko Widodo, if I remember right. But we treat that country appallingly. We make Indonesians jump through hoops even to get visitors visas to come to Australia. Visitors visas. They can't even. It's almost impossible for them to come here on a holiday. We make their lives that we do not treat them in when it comes to the practical matters like a friend at all. But we should be treating them like a friend because they're a huge market. I was at an event in Sydney last week and the Indonesian ambassador was there. One of his jobs, he told us as ambassador, is to make sure he has a quota to fill every year, 500,000 head of Australian cattle every year live shipped to Indonesia. And he described how much of a challenge it is to get that quota filled, right? And he spends a lot of time going around the country making sure that quota gets filled, because Indonesia needs those cattle for protein, and they have their own system of processing them up there. And that is they value their relationship with Australia. These are immense opportunities for us. This is just the biggest economies and fastest growing economies and the biggest population economies in the world are in our region, right? That is what Australia should be thinking about when it comes to our future. But what are you hearing from our two major parties? What you hear is our friends, the countries, they always talk about our friends, the countries we share values with. What does it mean? Think about what the Asian country, what Indonesia hears, what Malaysia hears, what Singapore hears, what China hears, what Vietnam hears when Richard Marles gets out there, the most boring politician in the history of the world, as the defense minister, gets up there and just drones on about these are the countries that we share values with, and that's why we're such good allies with the United Kingdom and the United States. What is it? What special values do we share that makes those countries that are literally on the other side of the world superior to the countries in our region? What are these values? What message are we sending to them? Are those two countries we share these values with, are they buttering our bread when it comes to the economy? No, we have a $40 billion trade deficit with the United States. I don't know what the British situation is. It's a joke. We're going to give them a blank check for submarines we'll never get. Yet the countries that we actually have the potential to collaborate with economically, we pay lip service to it, but by our actions, it's pretty damn weak, and we're putting all that at risk. So this question of economic sovereignty is the only way we'll navigate a multipolar world, and Australians need to understand that and vote accordingly. And that means vote for the Citizens Party.
Absolutely. Well, the fact is that the majority of the conversations over the next few weeks will not be about the things it should be about through the election campaign. That's going to be quite clear, right? And yet these big questions need to be tabled and thought about. And one of the reasons why this show exists is to try and get some of this discussion going, because it's not happening when it should be happening. And I guess if you think about that also in the context of the tariffs and, the way that Trump is now saying, well, maybe, tariffs will be lifted, and Australia is trying to sort of humbly go to the US, say, please, sir, don't tariff us, please, right? Actually, by the way, if tariffs were imposed on, say, China, we might actually find that there's more trade come our way, so that, it could be actually an interesting two-way street. So I think the problem we've got at the moment is that everyone's fixated on the tariff issue rather than this broader canvas that we've been painting here. And the fact is that this rules-based order that existed and benefited a relatively small number of countries, right, is now fragmenting, and a completely different philosophical superstructure is now emerging. But it needs a different set of thinking. It needs a different set of, frankly, politics and politicians to be able to track a path to the future. Because the concern I have, Robbie, at the moment is that the majority parties in Australia are likely to want to sort of put the clock back and try and put the genie back in the box and try and, continue to build the US as the dominant power. And it's like, you want to go back in the time machine and run the last 60 years again? Well, look how well we've done with neoliberalism and the way that economically has not helped ordinary people. Look at what's happened, to the standard of living in Australia because of the fallout from all of these things that have happened. And the point I want to make is, there is a different path which is potentially out there, but it's got to be a path based on, as you say, a much more equal weighting of relationships across the region and beyond, and autonomy and taking decisions in Australia for Australians. And for me, that actually is the critical takeout from this conversation.
Agreed. I think, Martin, the simplest way to contrast the new paradigm to the old paradigm is the new paradigm that is defining the world is oriented to development. The old paradigm was oriented to security. So everything was done in the name of security. America had to be the world's policeman and dominate the world for security. Now the countries of the world want development, and that's why the attraction of China, etc., and the BRICS and those and how rapidly those structures are growing. They see the development as how they deliver for their people, right? And you don't even. And here's a funny thing about governments: the particular government doesn't have to be that good a government. The people can have criticisms of their own government, but the worst dictatorship knows that it has to keep the public on side to some degree, because if the public ever rise up against any government, that government's gone, right? The public is the many, the leaders are always the few. And so totally pragmatically, all these countries are gravitating to this development perspective. And we're stuck in a security paradigm. That's the language of our politicians, a security paradigm. And because of that, we're denying ourselves so much. So let me give you just a little example of where we're at in this. Anthony Albanese was going to be the infrastructure prime minister. He was the infrastructure minister under the Gillard government and the infrastructure shadow minister for a long time. And he knows infrastructure. It's seemingly a sort of a passion of his, though now I've seen him in action for 3 years. I wonder how you would define passion when it comes to Anthony Albanese. Anyway, what's his girlfriend's name? Fiance's name? Jodie. Wonder what she would say about his passion. Anyway, enough of that. When Albo got elected, one of his first acts was to set up the High-Speed Rail Authority. Now, this is a country that's crying out for high-speed rail. You could have a high-speed rail network, Brisbane, Sydney, Canberra, Melbourne, Adelaide, and maybe eventually to Perth. The sky's the limit. But at least, there's potential to do that. He set up the High-Speed Rail Authority and budgeted $500 million to develop the first track from Newcastle to Sydney, which makes sense. If you're gonna have a first track, that makes sense to do it Newcastle to Sydney. He's now 3 years into his, the term is up. They've achieved nothing. They've only spent 80 million of the 500 million on a business case for the route that they still haven't completed. Now, what does China get done in that kind of time frame? And not just China, but Indonesia has got a high-speed train now that China helped them build. China's helped build high-speed trains in Laos and Vietnam and all these places. All these countries are getting high-speed rail, and Australia's not getting anything. And we can't even get our act together to complete a business case for Newcastle to Sydney. Now, so if we were going to be serious about high-speed rail, it would make perfect sense to look at the situation and go, well, okay, we've got some things in our favour. We've got Wollongong. We've got the steelworks in Wollongong. We've got Whyalla. We could keep Whyalla alive by starting a high-speed rail investment program, right? Let's start building high-speed rail in this country and make our own steel for high-speed rail, right? That'll give those factories a lease on life for a long time. So we've got that. Now, where are we going to get the money from? Well, we've got the solution to that. That's what a development bank is for. We could, if it was the Citizens Party government doing this, we could provide the money. What we don't have is the skills on how to build high-speed rail. So then it would make perfect sense to invite in a country that has those skills. Now, we don't have to go to China. You could go to Japan. You could go to South Korea. You could even go to France. But seriously, which country is the best of all those countries? Which country has broken all the records, right? Which country has the record for the fastest? I think it's 2 kilometers a day now. China's got some kind of a record for track laying. It's unbelievable what they're capable of. So you would get the Chinese in, or the Japanese. But I would be brave. The reason that's a debate is because people in Australia would say, I can't invite the Chinese. How would that look? Well, it'd look like we're smart. That's how it would look, because they're the ones who know how to do it. You get the Chinese in, you get Chinese companies to build the first leg for you. And what you're doing is you're training an Australian workforce and Australian skills, right? You're building up our capacity at the same time, so that as we go on to extend the track, right, we can start doing more and more of it ourselves as a country and have this capability. But nothing that if only the Citizens Party would be going to say that, because everyone else would say, "Oh, I can't have the Chinese in here." That would be considered some kind of invasion or something, right? And that's the sort of thing we're denying ourselves, the development we're denying ourselves because of our small-minded, security-oriented paranoia. That's trapping us in this old paradigm that's out of date. Doesn't even, it doesn't reflect the world we live in anymore.
Absolutely. The world has changed, and time that we woke up and, embrace the future, because the future's coming, mate, like it or not. Robbie, I want to say thank you very much indeed for your thoughts this evening. Really appreciated it. I know the chat's been appreciative too of the clarity of your commentary. If people want to find out more about the Citizens Party, where do they go to?
Well, citizensparty.org.au as our website. The Citizens Report on YouTube. You can look it up, Australian Citizens Party on YouTube. Quick plug, Martin. We have just uploaded today my interview with Associate Professor Andy Schmulo, who is the Citizens Party's Senate candidate for New South Wales. Please watch this interview. You've got to watch. If you haven't seen this interview, prioritize watching it. He is a powerhouse. We need to get this guy into the Senate. If any banker appears before Andy Schmulo in Senate estimates, he will dissect them and eat them for breakfast. He is that good. He will be a champion of the people against these corrupt bastards who are dominating it and corrupting our politics. The duopolies, the bank oligopolies, the retail duopolies, the big mining and all the vested interests, etc. He sees corporate Australia coming, and he is well armed to deal with them. Australia's never seen anything like him. If we had this guy in the Senate, we would change this country big time. And so I'm the Senate candidate for Victoria. He's the Senate candidate for New South Wales. I mentioned Asha Novakovic for WA. Jan Pakolis is the Senate candidate for Queensland. Louise Ackland, Senate candidate for South Australia. And Daz from Tas, we call him, Daryl Staggard, Senate candidate for Tasmania. You find all those on our website. We've got an election website up there now. The Citizens Party, as you working with you, Martin, closely, our close collaboration, we've achieved a lot in the parliamentary processes over the last 7 or 8 years, a lot. But it hasn't translated into votes, and it's time to translate it into votes, because we are the best qualified parliamentary party to get into parliament with all the work we've done. And we're attracting people of the caliber of Andy Schmulo, who's a law professor, who has also made incredible contributions to all these inquiries and exposing all the bad stuff. But we can do it through the parliamentary processes, but there's no one in there to drive the change that's needed. And that's why we're determined to get in there. And so don't play games with politics, people. Get behind the Citizens Party, because we're qualified to do what needs to be done. And you'll see that when you watch this interview on our YouTube channel with Andy Schmulo.
Well, thank you, Robbie, very much. And I'll try and get Andy on either a recorded or a live show, because he's got so much to say, and, particularly around the financial system and how it needs to be reformed, and other things too. Thank you very much for your time this evening, Robbie. Really appreciate it. And we'll look forward to the next conversation, which I suspect won't be that far away, given everything that's going on at the moment. A lot to talk about, but really appreciate it. I'm going to take you offline now, and I'm going to close the show. Well, there you go.
Thanks,
hope you enjoyed that, and really had some fun with some of the comments and everything. Jason, thank you very much for the super chat. Really appreciated that too. Just to say that next week we will be looking at the financial markets with Damien Klassen. So that'll be an interesting conversation about what's happened over the last month, with markets going sideways or down in areas, and a few interesting questions there. The dogs are still here. Yep, they've hardly moved, so it'll be time for their lunch and the next walk. So that's my next task. And I want to say thank you very much for you for spending some time with us this evening. I hope you found it interesting and stimulating. Look forward to seeing you on the next live show next Tuesday, and of course on our daily recorded shows. Meantime, this is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics signing off. Take care.